Thank you very much. Well, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our first debate of the Debating Union of the new academic term. This debate is titled, as you can see, Is it wrong not to identify as a feminist? On this side, arguing that everyone should identify as a feminist and that it is wrong not to do so, we have Emily Zinkin, a writer and editor of the F Word blog, and Julia Norman, a practising human rights and immigration barrister for 15 years. Arguing on the other side that it's okay not to be a feminist and there's nothing wrong with rejecting the label, we have Zara Faris, a researcher, writer and international speaker for the Muslim Defence Debate Initiative, who is currently writing a book titled Women's Rights Without Feminism. Now, ideally, we wanted Natasha Devon to be the other speaker, but due to unforeseen circumstances, she's had to drop out, and in under 24 hours, we have replaced her with the Debating Union President, Jordan Scott. Quick disclaimer, Jordan has agreed to fill in to create a balanced and informed debate. The views that he put across today are not necessarily his views or the views of the society, but we'll go for that. More broadly speaking, if anyone gets distressed or is upset by what's said today, please proceed to the back of the hall. There'll be a committee member to see you there. Okay, regarding the format of the debate, there'll be a first round of 5-minute speeches where speakers can sort of state their case for what they believe, and then there'll be a second round of speeches for rebuttal and expansion on ideas, and then finally a Q&A with you, the audience. So the orders of the speakers will be Julian will be going first, then it'll be Jordan, then Emily, and then Zara, and then second round will be Jordan, Julian, Zara and Emily, but I'll remind you more about that as we go into it. Okay, for the speakers, I'll bang the gavel once has been 4 minutes, and 3 times when it's time to stop. So, before we go into this, a quick show of hands. Who believes everyone should identify as a feminist? Just to see what we're all thinking. Hands up nice and high.
Nice and proud. What a fear.
Okay, I'm going to take that as 4. Everyone who believes everyone should identify as a feminist, raise your hands now.
Use the title.
Oh, sorry. Who believes it is wrong to identify as a feminist? Not to identify, sorry. Sorry, I'll get there at the end, you know.
Say yes or no.
I can do that, yeah, sure. Is it wrong not to identify as a feminist? Who says yes?
Who thinks it's wrong not to identify as feminist? Who thinks you must identify as feminist? I think that's what it is.
That's the one. Apologies for the wording. 1, 2, so we've got, count 3, count that as 3, yeah, okay. And for the other side, who's saying...
That you don't have to identify as feminist.
Yes. Anyone abstaining? Anyone don't want to put their eggs in?
Who's unsure?
Yeah, who's unsure? Nice and high, please, fellas.
What a fear again. Cool, guys.
Very good. Okay, so without further ado, I'll sit down and be quiet. And I believe I'm inviting Julian up first to speak.
By the lectern.
Sorry?
By the lectern. Oh yeah, feel free to use the lectern.
Yes, you can go to the lectern.
Yeah,
Very good. Let me just get my handy dandy timer out. Okay. Whenever you're ready.
Hi, thank you for having me here today. As well as being barrister, I'm chair of Filia. You've got cards there that tell you what that is. So that tells you that I am a feminist. And before I speak to this motion, I think it would be very helpful to say, well, what is a feminist? It's a political viewpoint. It talks to individual advancement. Feminism is not about getting a few individual women to achieve more than they previously had. That's nice, might be a nice side effect, but that is not what it's about. It's not, and this is something that I am very keen to say, it is not a broad let's be nice to everyone movement in which women do all of the heavy lifting of emotional, social and intellectual labour. Okay, so sorry about that if that was what people were hoping for. And it's not entirely simply about equality of opportunity, although again that is a good side effect of structural feminism. Feminism, I would say, is about the liberation of women as a class. So what do we mean by that? Why do we need liberating? I mean, here we are, I'm standing here at a university. I have a job as a barrister. I can vote, for goodness sake. What more do I want? Well, because tempting as it is to see our own generation as perfect and not like the bad old days where there was terrible sexism and women were deliberately paid less and weren't allowed to work. This is the bad old days right now. These are the bad old days of the future. These are the bad old days in which the other day women were told not to wear headphones when they go out in case they get raped. The onus should never be on women not to wear headphones. It's one in which, at the very best, serial misogynists are appointed to positions of extreme power. Brett Kavanaugh was the one that I was thinking of there, but there are plenty of others. It's one in which, in the field in which I work, I know of lesbian refugees who have been strongly encouraged by organs of the state in which we live to produce video evidence of their sexuality for what I think might be more than purely evidential purposes, and they don't know what has happened to those clips. It's one in which spy cops is allowed to happen. It's the bad old days in which women die. Somebody died relatively recently for want of access to safe, legal abortion. It's one in which the toxic gender expectations imposed on small children from birth result in girls with chronic body image difficulties, boys told that healthy, red-blooded masculinity involves sexualised images of women screaming in pain, and in which boys are told that masculine strength means repressing all emotions bar anger, and that results in what are chronically high male suicide rates. I could go on and on and on, but these are structural problems. And if you want these structures to change, then that is a feminist analysis. And it must be structural, because a system in which we simply say, well, we can mend this, we'll market the body image hang-ups to men as well, and let's repress women's emotions too. That may lead to equality, but that is not feminism. So that is why I would say we should all identify as feminists. Surely all of us want those structures to change. There can't be one of us here who thinks that those structures are simply something that we should put up with. And whether or not you would call yourself a feminist, whether or not you would attach the label, that is what it is. So, closing, is it enough to identify as a feminist? Theresa May in her "This is what a feminist looks like" t-shirt, imposing austerity on a nation? No. That video of the woke bloke kicking a woman who disagreed with him because he was on the feminist side of pro-choice? Nope. It is not enough to identify as a feminist. You must be identifiable as a feminist through actions, by analysis, by interactions with everybody else. And that is not a new feminist perspective. I will close with the words of that sentiment 100 years earlier: deeds, not words.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'd like to call Jordan up to respond.
I will use the lectern because I like having something to hide behind.
No worries. So if you see me sinking lower and lower and gradually out of sight, you'll know things aren't going very well. Okay, thank you. So before I begin laying out my argument, I should probably address the elephant in the room. As Tom said, I had to film this role at short notice, and I can see a few faces in the audience that seem to be wondering, what can I as a male really say on feminism? You know, what could I have to offer that could be of any worth at all? And to that I'd say that this is a debate that affects everyone regardless of gender. Our opponents are arguing that everyone should be a feminist, and so it doesn't only apply to women. And I think it's important to have a diverse panel discussing this issue. I expect that a fair portion of this debate is going to involve wrangling over what exactly the definition of feminism is, and I'll come back to that later in the speech. I suspect that our opponents have a different idea of it than what we do, and I'm certainly not going to try and give you a definitive answer to what feminism is. That would be mad of me to try. But I will try and show why I think it can't be considered, for example, merely a belief in gender equality, which Julian seemed to agree with in her view. So my first point for why I think it can be okay not to be a feminist is that people who care a lot about gender equality may reasonably feel that identifying as feminist is to kind of have a slightly narrower scope of the issue of gender equality. They feel like it might ignore issues of sexism oppressing men and only focus on issues of sexism oppressing women. I'm sure this is a definition that our opponents will argue, but I'll get to that in a bit. People who are equally concerned with male and female sexism may just feel that the term doesn't properly apply to them, and they may feel that quite reasonably. And I'm going to try and show why that's a reasonable position to take. I'm not obviously arguing that it's a bad thing to identify as feminist. I'm not arguing that it's a narrow scope in a negative sense. It's still very vital to focus on a part of a larger problem, but I will be suggesting that it is a part of a larger problem. Gender equality is something that affects both men and women. It's needed by both, and it benefits both. There's plenty of examples of sexism oppressing women, and there's plenty of examples of sexism oppressing men. For example, countless women expected to live subservient domestic lives throughout history is clearly blatantly unfair, and so have all the men throughout history expected to go and fight in wars they wanted no part in. There's plenty of cases where both have been negatively affected by it. History is riddled with unfairness, unfortunately, and both men and women have suffered as a result of it. I'm not going to weigh in on which side had it worse. I don't think that's a particularly helpful thing to get into. But the point is we all have something to gain from equality. Now, feminism does concern itself primarily with championing women's issues, and rightly so. There are plenty of these issues to champion. However, in doing so, I'd argue that it is largely ignoring those issues of equality that mainly affect men. And this by itself doesn't diminish the good work it does, but it does mean that it's only focusing on part of a larger problem. So there may be plenty of people that are in favour of gender equality and want to take steps to do something about it, but feel that feminism just doesn't rightly express the broader view they take on the issue. And for these people, seeing as the label of feminist doesn't quite reflect their attitudes, I'm arguing that it would be absurd to say that not identifying as a feminist would be morally wrong for these people. My next reason why I think it's acceptable to sometimes reject the label of feminist is the very fact that we can't really agree on what feminism means. I suspect we're going to spend a lot of this debate arguing back and forth over what our own personal interpretation of it means. But regardless of whether you believe that feminism is just a belief in gender equality, or whether it's that and something more, or whether it's something else entirely, you have to admit that not everyone else will share that opinion. There's certainly no clear consensus on the issue. And I'd argue that if there is no clear consensus on the issue, I don't know on what grounds we can tell people that they're morally obliged to identify something if they can't pin down what exactly it means. This is a debate within feminism that shows no sign of being resolved soon. There's issues of what kinds of people can be feminist, what exactly it means to be feminist, what ideas and causes a feminist should naturally support. And all of these are problems for people who want to say definitively that everyone should identify as feminist. And such, I think it's perfectly acceptable for people to be supportive of gender equality, but argue that no, the label of feminist just doesn't quite fit me. I can't nail down what it means, so I'm not going to use that label. So for those two reasons, that feminism could imply a slightly narrower scope and have a focus on oppressing women that not everyone, a focus on inequality oppressing women that not everyone may share, and that there's no clear consensus about what being feminist involves, I believe that you can be perfectly justified in not identifying as a feminist, and this doesn't make you any less supportive of gender equality. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'd like to call upon Emily to state her case.
Righty. I've no particular opinions on where to stand, but I'll go here. Okay. So as people have said already, I think the first thing we need to do before we discussing feminism as a personal identity is to define it. And as it has been pointed out, this can be a tricky issue. So I'm going to use the dictionary. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines feminism as the theory of political, economic and social equality of the sexes, or organised activity on behalf of women's rights and interests. So digging deeper, the core values of feminism are: sexism, it does exist. Sexism against women, e.g. misogyny, is enduring, pervasive, systematic, cultural, ingrained. And that men and women should have equal rights and opportunities, that women are intellectual equals and social equals to men, women should be recognised and treated as equals to men. But what do we mean when we refer to equality? Now, for some, there is a fear that equality means ignoring any differences between men and women, or expecting them to behave in the same way and want the same things. But I would argue that social equality is defined as where all people within a specific society have the same status in certain respects, including civil rights, freedom of speech, property rights, and equal access to certain social goods and services. It also includes concepts of health equality, economic equality, equal opportunities, and other social securities. Therefore, when I say social equality as a part of feminism, I mean the absence of legally enforced social boundaries and the absence of discrimination motivated by an inalienable part of a person's identity, which also does include sex and gender. Another common misconception about feminism is that it prevents many from being able to identify with it because it is anti-man. However, feminism, I believe, should not be viewed through the lens of men versus women, but as humanity versus the patriarchy. If we view society as the entirety of relations of a community, then a patriarchal society consists of a male-dominated power structure throughout organised society and in individual relationships. Power is also directly related to privilege. In a system in which men have more power than women, men have some level of privilege to which women are not entitled. Therefore, to be feminist is to be recognised that our society has structures of power that benefit a few to the detriment of many. And this is just not the case of only between men and women, because identity is never that simple. It's gender combined with class, race, age, religion, sexual orientation, and 1,000 other factors, which intersect to affect how patriarchy affects us as individuals. These power structures are reinforced by legal and social systems that we are taught from such a young age that we view them as the natural order of things. Young boys are praised as being leadership material, while girls are called bossy, which influences who is promoted in the workplace decades later. Girls are statistically more likely to have chores than boys, which reinforces the notion that housework should predominantly fall to women. But whilst these structures ultimately benefit a few, they ultimately hurt everyone. As Jordan pointed out, patriarchy stifles men's self-expression and creates toxic masculinity, which is as responsible for male suicide as it is for domestic abuse. This is why everyone should be a feminist. And for the term feminist, yes, absolutely, it does affect us all. The reason it is called feminist is because, as Jordan also pointed out, it does predominantly affect women, though men are hurt as well. So why doesn't everyone identify as a feminist? Once you get past the definitions and semantics of what being a feminist is, there can only be two reasons. Firstly, you don't believe in social equality. You believe men are inherently superior to women and that the current social order is asserting the natural superiority of one sex over others. If that is the case, it will take more than a 5-minute speech for me to convince you. But I am an optimist and I don't believe that most people do believe that. The other reason is that you believe social equality has already been achieved. Unfortunately, the world around us likes to disprove this every day. Look at sexual harassment, the gender pay gap, domestic abuse figures, the fact that more CEOs are called John than are women. The list goes on. Kavanagh is always in our minds this week, but there'll be another example waiting just round the corner. But I would like to finish with a personal story. In my first week of university, I was approached by a young woman at a freshers' fair and asked very politely if I would like to join the Women's Network. Bearing in mind, it's Women's Network, not Feminist Network. I said, I'm not a feminist. She gave me an odd look but took the hint and left me alone. In my last year of university, I ended up being a founding member of the university's feminist campaigning group. Therefore, whilst I strongly believe it's wrong to not identify as a feminist, I am slightly more sympathetic if it's the case of not identifying as one yet, due to not liking the terminology or not being, educated enough. But we live in a world of unprecedented access to information, and I would urge you all to do your research, recognise any privilege that you may have, and use it to lift up others and make the world a more feminist place. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon Zara now to conclude the first round.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for inviting me to take part in this debate tonight. My name is Zara Faris, and I, for one, am very excited about this debate title. And this is because, for several years, I have focused specifically on working towards women's rights without feminism, from the basis of my own belief system, which is Islam. Now, for the proposition to impose the label feminism implies that feminism has some kind of monopoly on women's rights. But just as capitalism and communism are different approaches to economics, feminism too is just one approach to women's rights. And Islam, like other worldviews, provides other approaches. Now, very briefly, Islam enshrined women's rights to property, women's right to work, and that leaders could only be legitimized with the consent of both women as well as men, all 1,300 years before Western states granted these rights to its citizens. And all this was achieved without anyone needing to identify or use the label feminist or feminism. Now, in fact, in Western secular liberal states, women's suffrage, property rights, and right to work were achieved by campaigners, as we'll go into very briefly, who didn't even use the label feminist. They didn't use the labels of feminism. Even in secular liberal states such as the UK today, polls show that actually, in around 2016, only 7% of women identify as feminist, even though the majorities of men and women actually reported believing in gender equality. They wanted the women in their lives to have the same opportunities as the men. Now, this shows that those who identify as feminists don't really wield any kind of monopoly on women's rights or the liberal idea of equality. And those who identify as feminists are just one group amongst the many throughout different cultures and times whose work deals with women's rights. But let's be clear, the question today isn't about those who do choose to call themselves feminists. If they want to, if you want to, whoever wants to call themselves a feminist, that is up to them. The question of this debate is it wrong not to? This is for those people who choose not to identify as a feminist. So should women, or even men, not have the autonomy that many feminisms invoke to choose a name that they find works better for them and their cause without facing social stigma and, the harsh rebuke that voting yes today would imply? Did the suffragettes or the suffragists campaign under the banner of being feminists? Mary Wollstonecraft's book, A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, became a keystone text for women's rights, and it didn't need to create or use the label of feminism. What about Caroline Norton? For those of you who don't know, she pushed for women's rights in the 19th century in child custody law, women's right to form contracts, inherit, keep possession of their own earnings. She never identified herself as a feminist, and in fact, she was notoriously anti-equality between men and women. Even liberals today consciously choose not to use the label. Some report finding the term feminist or feminism an encumbrance, and with its multitude of competing interpretations, factions, and divisions that have already been brought up today, they find it doesn't really add any ideological clarity to their cause or for their audiences. And in fact, many feminists seem to spend a lot of time attempting to clarify to the public what they think being a feminist means. So, should liberal campaigners for women's rights be condemned as wrong, morally wrong, or wrong in any other way, because they choose to campaign under terms that are more publicly recognized and readily accepted and embraced in liberal societies? Terms such as women's rights activist, terms such as human rights activists, terms such as egalitarian. And because the term feminist doesn't seem to advance a cause at an institutional level, like in court cases, for example, most human rights lawyers identify professionally as, human rights lawyers, not as, feminist lawyers. I think even our colleague here, Julian, identifies as a human rights lawyer. So the feminist label, historically and in law, isn't seen to augment argument. It isn't seen to advance authority in any way. And it's only mentioned twice in passing in the history of the US Supreme Court, for example. Only twice. So let's not forget that our work should be in service of justice, not in the service of the label of feminism just for its own sake, just for the sake of the label. Now, the proposition or others may argue that, the label feminism, it's just about inculcating and reminding people about the equality of men and women, and that if you believe in the equality of men and women, then you're already a feminist. But if that's the case, then why do I need to identify as a feminist? And if it's merely about the equality of the sexes, then the proposition must also argue, which I sense they may be reluctant to do so, that it is wrong not to identify as a meninist or a men's rights activist, because they too define their label as belief in equality of the sexes too. Thank you.
Okay, that concludes the first round. Second round now. I call upon, I believe it's Jordan.
Thank you, Tom. Okay, I feel silly taking the lecture now when I'm the only one, so I'll stay seated. Okay, so if I could begin by addressing kind of some of the points that were raised by the opposition team. Like I suspect all of us in this room knew, there was always going to be some wrangle about what exactly it means to be feminist. It's a vague question, and it's a question that's always going to provoke disagreement among any group of debaters. I did seem to notice the definition Julian seemed to give seemed different to the definition Emily was giving. Emily was very much the kind of textbook dictionary definition of feminism, whereas Julian seemed to mean something else by it. It's not merely a case of believing in equality between genders, but it's about kind of being an activist, about kind of going out and making change. It's a much more activist definition. But this surely raises the problem of what if people who just don't particularly consider themselves activists? Or what if people don't consider themselves activists for feminism? You can have, it's a point I'll raise slightly later, but you can be an activist for all sorts of things these days. It seems that, under your definition, relatively few people would be feminists unless they're literally out there trying hard to make a change. You couldn't have sort of passive feminists, people that are feminists but don't really do much about it. And that seems to create a problem, because if we're trying to argue that everyone should be feminists, that has to be feasible. It has to be possible for everyone to be a feminist. Otherwise, what business would we have saying it? Similarly, you went on to talk about the liberation of women as something that we should be doing if we're feminists. But there are all sorts of problems people could be out addressing in the world that aren't necessarily the liberation of women, that people may dedicate their lives to. And we wouldn't think any less of them as people. We wouldn't think they're doing something morally wrong by engaging in that rather than working towards the liberation of women. I think Zara made my next rebuttal better than I can. So it's this idea that Emily seemed to form the idea that there's just no reason not to identify as a feminist. There's no good reason at the very least. But the trouble is, feminism is a movement with baggage. It's hard to define what it means. A lot of people take a lot of different things by it. And I don't see why people can't do the same work, but just not accept the term. You can not identify as a feminist, but you could still be out there campaigning to, help the vulnerable in society and help women in society every day. So now to a couple more points why I think it's okay not to identify as feminist. One, and this may be a contentious one, but feminism as a movement has become, I think, increasingly politicized recently. And it's become very much tied to left-wing politics. And now, it's very debatable whether or not that's a bad thing. I tend towards left-wing, and we're in a university, so I can only estimate that most people in this room also do. But it is a curious thing, and on the face of it, there doesn't seem to be a good reason why gender equality should be associated with the left as opposed to the right. Why not both? But increasingly we're seeing the notion gain traction that to be right-wing is almost incompatible with feminism. There's plenty of articles online questioning whether it's even possible for Theresa May to be a feminist simply because she's a conservative politician. And this seems to do away with the idea that it's some sort of unifying ideology which everyone should be a part of, because a big chunk of the country would see themselves as on the right, and they might rightly see that not rightly see, but they might reasonably say that the label just isn't for them. Another point I'd like to make is that to some degree it seems like it would diminish the idea of feminism, especially kind of Julian's definition of feminism, if it was something we were all morally kind of required to do. When we talk of feminism and feminists, the images that come to mind of, activists, people working hard to change things in society. But I don't see how that's compatible with the kind of notion that it's something we should all do. It seems to get rid of the possibility of the kind of a more passive feminist. It's a terrible term I've just made up off the top of my head, but it'll do. So, and like I was saying earlier, there's plenty of issues in today's day and age that you could be passionate about, and feminism is just one of them. You know, a person who dedicates their life to eradicating a disease isn't doing something morally wrong by making that their life's work rather than feminism. And if you're going by this kind of activist definition, it does feel like you could potentially only have one, and it does raise a problem. So, because I'm running out of time. So, to conclude, in this speech, I'm trying to argue that the way we talk about feminism and the way we think about it seems to be a political movement, an activist movement, a social movement, rather than some sort of abstract idea of equality. And if this is the case, then it's okay not to call yourself a feminist if you think your politics don't quite align with what the term normally construes, or if you just don't consider yourself much of an activist. However, like I said, I'm not going to force a definition on you, and for those of you that completely think that's a terrible definition, then that just reinforces my earlier point, that you don't need to be something you don't know what it means. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I call upon Julian to make her case.
I just want to respond to a couple of those points. I think that the overall way to look at this is that this is the problem that we get when we take a political perspective and we turn it instead from politics to identity. Because really, would you ask somebody who is a Conservative voter, do you identify as a Conservative? I think Zara said that I don't identify as a human rights lawyer. No, of course I don't identify as a human rights lawyer. I am a human rights lawyer.
No, I said you do. I said you do identify as a human rights lawyer.
It's not about a political viewpoint, much like a job or anything else that we do, is not just an identity to be assumed and shrugged off as the occasion suits. And that doesn't mean that you must be an active feminist, because passive feminism, and it is a terrible term, congratulations, even with little actions, if somebody wolf whistles or shouts something towards a girl and you're there and you say, actually that wasn't cool, that is active feminism. It doesn't have to be world-changing, earth-shattering views. And the fact that historically women didn't use the word feminism doesn't mean that they were any less feminist for it. I spent a weekend recently at the Working Class Library Museum in Manchester, and I was looking through all the old suffragette leaflets, including some of the old anti-suffrage leaflets, which are fascinating. One of the biggest arguments against women's suffrage, used by women and men, was that if we let women in the UK have the vote, the next thing we know, we'll have to let men and women in the colonies have the vote. And what would happen then? And of course, the women's suffrage societies were saying, well, what would be wrong with that? They didn't use the words egregious racism because they didn't have that terminology, but that's certainly what it was. So the fact that they didn't use the words feminism back then doesn't make them any less feminist for it. So I think the question is perhaps not perfectly worded, because it assumes that feminism is not a political viewpoint, but rather an identity. And it's not, it's a politics. And it's a politics on which those engaged are not all unified, in the same way as socialists don't all agree, environmentalists don't all agree. And those are not identities either, those are political viewpoints. I would urge everybody in this room to take the view that the removal of structural inequality towards women globally is one which we can and should adopt for our own politics. And if you agree with that, then it is wrong not to identify as a feminist.
Thank you very much. I'd like to call upon Zara to make her case.
So I haven't heard any reasons just yet, although we haven't from Emily yet, as to why feminism is still being perceived as the only solution to women's rights. We acknowledge that there are issues that women face. We acknowledge that there are these, trials and these difficulties. But again, why only feminism? And if somebody does choose to, intervene if someone is being wolf whistled or harassed, why is that feminism and not anything else? Why is it not another good deed from a different worldview? Why is it not anyone just being a good Samaritan? So I'd still like to hear as to why feminism should be given the sole discretion or the exclusivity on anything that does good to women. And again, just to reiterate, if I saw someone, harassing somebody on the street, I would intervene, not because I'm a feminist, but because I like to think I'm a good person, or mainly because as a Muslim, I would be obligated to intervene, to not allow an injustice to perpetuate. Another point that was brought up was that, women of the past didn't call themselves feminists, but that doesn't mean that they were not feminists. But the whole point of this debate is identifying as a feminist. So it's about the label, because people can, as the survey showed, believe in gender equality, believe in rights for women, without using the label feminist. So this is still about the label. And it's interesting because, and I mentioned one of these individuals earlier, Caroline Norton, but just for a little bit of colour on that, who brought about a lot of legal changes that set the stage for women's movements in the UK, or at least very particular key ones. And I mentioned that she was actually fiercely anti-equality. She wrote in her pamphlet to the Queen in the 19th century, she wrote, "The natural position of woman is inferiority to man. I never pretended to the wild and ridiculous doctrine of equality." And yet today, she is anachronistically slapped with the label, the first feminist legislator. So it just also points to the fact that the word feminism could mean anything you want it to mean at any different or particular time. And this is leads to another problem that I have with the label. Now, if the purpose of identifying as something is to demarcate yourself from a different worldview, then what's the benefit in identifying with an unclear label? It doesn't demarcate you from any other thing. And far from being wrong to not identify as a feminist, I guess a strong case could be made for people to actually use clearer terms, such as some of the ones I mentioned earlier: egalitarian, women's rights activist, if you want to focus on bringing attention to women's rights. You see, because feminism gives the latitude for feminists to come up with so many different interpretations and definitions as to what feminism is, so why does it not then give the latitude for people to come up with an interpretation that lets them decide they don't want to identify as a feminist? Surely it should have room to do that as well. And just to end on, maybe a little bit more actually, it's also a point that Jordan mentioned earlier. If you use the term women's rights activist, I strongly believe, and from experience as well, you can bypass a lot of the friction and pushback you get than if you use the word feminist. Particularly from example, in the Muslim community, if you invoke women's rights as they are enshrined in the Quran and the Hadith and the Islamic sources, there is no pushback. If you use the word feminism, you're going to inculcate or invite a lot of different ideas and doubts about what you're really trying to achieve. So use clear terms that don't have friction, that get your job done, that get you to your goal, that don't slow you down. And similarly, if you choose to identify yourself as a women's rights activist, it doesn't mean that you're against, environmental activism or child rights activism or, animal rights activism. It's just showing that you choose to focus on a particular stream. And as Jordan said, it doesn't mean that you don't care about those issues. So if, for example, myself as a Muslim, I choose to identify as a Muslim because I believe that is an all-encompassing term and it also covers women's rights, that doesn't mean that I'm against women's rights or the causes or the issues that women face. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'd like to call upon Emily to make a case.
Wow, we've heard quite a lot of speeches, and as Jordan has pointed out, quite a lot of intersections in what we're talking about, and as he pointed out at the start, it really all comes down to semantics. whilst there are a million definitions of feminism, I would argue that it does come down to women's rights and human rights. It comes down to everyone's rights. And this whole, we don't want to put a label, and I don't want to put a label onto people who don't want it. That is in itself against my feminism. But I am concerned around the stigma of the label feminist. Using terms that don't have friction, as Zara put it, certainly does sometimes short-term make things easier and quicker. But I just want to go into why it's an unlikable label. As we've all talked about, feminism is about men and women's rights. So why is emphasising that it's feminist the issue? We were joking earlier about when the term humanist would come up. As we've all talked about, toxic masculinity and patriarchy affects everyone, but it does predominantly affect women. So feminism is saying that if we solve patriarchy and toxic masculinities, everyone benefits, but women are going to be the greater beneficiaries because they are generally the greater oppressed. So I want to go into why that isn't nice, why people don't like that. It reminds me of politics. We've talked about politics, we've talked about Theresa May. In politics, one thing I've noticed is that women's issues, women's rights, are always something that government is getting around to. There's very few MPs nowadays who are brave enough to say they don't care, but there's always something more important. Women's issues we'll get round to that when X is covered. If it's not Brexit, it's always going to be something else. Feminism is saying that it can't wait. Women are 51% of this country and 52% of the global population. Why are we constantly waiting? I would argue that to say egalitarian or humanist rather than to say feminist is to still say that yes, everyone matters, but women can wait. I don't think they should. I'd also like to point out intersectionality. One of the issues with feminism is white feminism, trans-exclusionary feminist. Yes, feminism has been co-opted and has been dirtied as a term by different people's perspectives. I would argue that feminism, in my perspective, is intersectional. It's saying that we all have multiple identities that intersect and, as I said before, affect how the world interacts with us. I don't think that feminism or intersectionality, or indeed intersectional feminism, are achieved until everyone is lifted up and everyone has barriers removed that are, and everyone's privileges equalised. Feminism, in my perspective, is an act. I suppose it is a politics. And lastly, it is an identity. I think it is an easy word to say you're human rights, you're for women's rights. So I would just want to say, if that is the basic definition, no matter how people cut it and dry it, why are we so anti the word feminist? So many of you said you didn't say the thing that everyone should identify as feminist, but I'm sure that most of you do believe in human rights and women's rights. So I'd just like you to think for yourselves, why am I so against the word feminism? Why do I believe it's dirty? I'd also like to say that I know people laughed the first time I brought up the word patriarchy. It has become a slightly overused word, but isn't it beneficial for the patriarchy and for certain people's privilege for us to dislike the word feminism? Isn't it just another excuse for women's issues to be something we'll get around to when we have the time? Toxic masculinity doesn't mean we can break issues apart. We've talked about we can argue for men's rights and women's rights as if they're separate things. That's like saying that, that sexual orientation rights are a completely separate issue. No, they're not a separate issue, because women and men and their sexual orientation and their race and their age, all of these things, we can't separate ourselves. I can't separate myself into female, disabled, queer, Jewish. All of these things are part of who I am. I can't be like, I'm doing the Jewish thing today and I'll do queer tomorrow. It doesn't work that way. We absolutely need to work on one thing at a time, because there's so many issues wrong with this world, as people have pointed out. But ultimately the root cause affects everything, and therefore that's why I think it does all need to be brought into one label, and why once we sort out the root cause, we'll have sorted out most things, that we do all need to, that's such a big ask, we do all need to work on our individual issues, whether that is curing an incurable disease, the environment, or women's rights. I would also argue, though, that incurable diseases and the ecology also affect women and men, and are therefore feminist issues. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So we've heard two speeches from each person. We've heard a lot from these guys. What do you think? This is the question and answer segment. Raise your hands up nice and high, ask a question, and each side will respond. Yes, sir.
Sorry, you on the left, I can't remember your name.
It's Emily.
It's Emily. You said that if you identify as egalitarian and not feminist, you're saying that women's rights can wait. Is that, I'm just confirming that.
Thank you for bringing it up if it was unclear. What I am saying is that I am concerned as to why people prefer the term egalitarian to feminist. What I am saying is that this fear of the label feminism, which does, Zara's perfectly right, it does cause friction sometimes, but I am talking about why that is. Why does feminism cause friction whereas egalitarian doesn't? If we consider men to have certain privileges that women don't, and I'd also like to point out that, white people have privileges that other people don't, straight people have privileges, so this is not a cut and dried issue, it's always an intersectional issue. But if we say that, then I think the best metaphor I can have for this is Black Lives Matter. I think all of us can look at the brutality of police against black people in America and go, God, that's pretty awful. And then I see all the people saying, all lives matter. Now, yes, absolutely, all lives matter. No one is denying it. Certainly the Black Lives Matter activists are not denying it. But it's not all lives that are being gunned down by police in America. And I think feminism and egalitarian are terms similar to that, though I apologise if that comparison offends anyone. I'm saying that all lives do matter, that, we all should be egalitarian, but the word feminism is to say that women have some catching up to do when it comes to rights, and that if we only say egalitarian and not feminism, I am personally concerned we are yet again saying egalitarian almost implies that women and men are on equal footing already. Feminism implies that women have some catching up to do. Okay, does that answer the question?
But I feel as though you're prioritising women's rights over men's rights, even though, of course, I understand there are issues with gender equalities for women, but there are also the same for men, and I feel like you're prioritising the ones for women instead of just prioritising all of them at once.
As I said before, I think that the patriarchy is ultimately what feminism is fighting against. The patriarchy leads to toxic masculinity, which affects all of us. As I said before, toxic masculinity is as relevant to male suicide as it is for domestic abuse, which affects men and women, but predominantly affects women. I think if we can solve toxic masculinity and the patriarchy, we'll solve a lot of those issues. I say the root cause is what we should be tackling, ultimately. Now, does that mean we put women over men? Not necessarily, no, but I am concerned at this idea that feminism is prioritising women. Women have less privilege, ultimately, than men do. And so, therefore, feminism will ultimately benefit them slightly more. But I think if we tackle feminism, we are attacking issues that affect men and women. Therefore, we shouldn't be dividing them into men's issues and women's issues.
Okay. Anybody else have a question? At the front there.
So Julie, I think you mentioned in, I think it was one of the first things you said, is that the definition of feminism is, I think, elevating women as a class.
Liberating.
Liberating women as a class, yeah.
Very different meanings.
Yeah, very different meanings. But the point remains is that that class association, and Emily was talking about it as well, was with slightly differently with the patriarchy and it overthrowing that structure, which is inherently, what to me, a revolutionary idea. And there's nothing wrong with that. My point is that, as Jordan touched upon, is inherently left-wing, I think. And so do you think that because it involves these overthrowing of these structures, as well as liberating, the women as class, which, again, with class politics often associated with the left, do you think that it is they are incompatible as a result? So do you have to be, not necessarily, but by implication, have to be left-wing to identify as feminist?
This is a really fascinating one, and there's no way that we have time in 5 minutes to cover it. Is it possible to take a class-based analysis of women's rights, or indeed anybody else's, if you don't come to it from a class-based analysis in the first place, which is obviously a fairly Marxist analysis? So is it possible, for example, to be a conservative feminist or a right-wing feminist? I think that some of the principles of conservatism, small c conservatism, are incompatible with my feminism, but I'm not the only onion in the feminist mince. and I know that this is a debate which is going to rage on and on within feminism, because this is something that is quite important, is that women are not a hive mind. We don't all go back and plug into the pink ball. We have lots of different thoughts because, we're people. And so I know that, some feminist groups are criticised for being too liberal, some for being too radical, some for being too Marxist, Christian feminists, Muslim feminists. But we are all feminists. At the end of the day, we are all seeking to liberate women on that class-based analysis that recognises that women are a thing. And so, yes, I think that there is. I have seen an argument made for a feminist Brexit. Do I agree with every moment of that analysis? No, I don't, but it's a legitimate analysis, and it's a political analysis. Because, like I said earlier, feminism is not an identity per se, it is a political viewpoint. And it's also not exclusive, so that it's not as though one identifies as a feminist, and then that's it, you have no other political viewpoints. You will find within feminism, environmentalist activists, Marxist activists, there is a thriving right-wing feminism community in America. It's not one whose politics I necessarily adopt, but would I say that they're not feminist? I think that you would have to pause very much before you say that. So again, when we talk about, is it wrong not to identify as feminist, you are not saying it is wrong not to have one sole thought on the topic, because no politics which dictates your thoughts is ever a healthy one. There must always be room for debate within any political movement, and so for that reason I would say it does tend to attract people who already have a class-based analysis. Is that to the exclusion of those who don't? I don't believe so.
Would you like to respond, or is that,
No, that's
good? Okay, right at the back there.
So we've talked about people being afraid of the word feminist, and that's a question for everyone. Because I've noticed that lately, I feel like the feminist movement is kind of focusing on trivial issues in the Western world, whereas so many women in other parts of the world are going through a lot worse than here. So I was thinking, for instance, how we talk so much about mansplaining and manspreading here, whereas, in Pakistan you have to marry a rapist, basically. So I was thinking, what do you think about that? So do you think maybe the fact that feminism kind of changed in those last few years and is focusing more on those, what I think personally are trivial issues, is kind of tainting the world for other people? Question for everyone.
I'll jump in on that one. Just to also include in that response, so Emily mentioned something earlier about how egalitarian is not really a sufficient term because feminism has more of a it can't wait to it. So feminism can't wait in comparison with egalitarian, where Emily's suggesting that women's issues get pushed to the back of the queue, get pushed to a later time, put on the back burner. The thing is, the idea that feminism saying it can't wait, we have to remember that feminism is not an animate being. It's people. It's people that are feminists. It's people behind it. It's not about the label feminism. When these changes do occur and people push for changes, it's not because they're using the word feminism, but it's because of people's wills, their determination, and their persistence. And I really think that persistence is a far greater quality in creating change than the label feminism. And I believe that with the term like egalitarian, and again, because of the stigma around the term feminism, and I feel that part of that is its history, the history behind the word feminism, and this is why, linking into what you asked, the term applied in other countries doesn't translate the same way as it may be perceived here in the UK or in the States. So, for example, in the Muslim world, the term feminism is received even more negatively because it's seen as a foreign colonial ideology that is coming into the Muslim world to try and change things, try and control things, try to subvert the status quo. And you mentioned also how in Pakistan people have to marry their rapists. I'm not sure whether that's accurate. But it's not. Again, it's not something that is from Islam. It may be something that happens because of what is, I don't know what kind of thing would give rise to that. But the reality is that in the Muslim world as well, to create change, if you advocate the principles that Islam teaches on crime, on rape, on all of these things, that would be a more powerful and a more catalytic way to create positive change in the Muslim world. And I think carrying over terms feminism or borrowing these ideologies lends too much weight to, again, this monopoly that feminism thinks that it has, that any time we're talking about women's rights, somehow it's about feminism. Let's try and imagine if we can talk about women's rights without referring to feminism. And there was one other thing that was raised about the patriarchy and how we have to, take it down. And one of the ways that, is suggested, maybe not just here today, but generally also in feminist literature and thought, is, I guess, to swing the pendulum harder the other way, so that if we enforce or push for more rights to women, eventually that will balance the scale out between, men and women. So that's often, the approach among some schools of feminism, and even more so with radical feminists. So with radical feminists, I think they don't even hide the fact that they're not really interested in equality, not really getting half of the cake, but having the whole cake, and maybe throwing it out afterwards. So the different, schools of thought in feminism, and the differences, and trying to create this imbalance to correct another imbalance, is just going to lead again to this cyclical oppression between the genders. And one other thing that also you mentioned is to do with intersectional feminism. So the idea that, to address injustice, you have to think about different causes that give rise to that injustice. But even the strand of intersectional feminism is itself an acknowledgement that feminism itself is not equipped to deal with the multifaceted state of the problems that we face today. And so again, I would ask, why feminism? Why do we have to identify as feminism, as feminists, or with feminism in order to create change? And again, the question today isn't about one's choice to identify as feminist, but actually it's about condemning people for not making the choice to identify as feminist. So just to remind you of the question today, that is what we're really asking, and I urge you all to vote no and keep the way or the freedom that we have to choose how we identify and how we practice as not being restrictive, but as being diverse and open to other ways of thinking.
I'll weigh in on this question too. It's a very good point. It's an idea of there being more important issues than other issues. Now, the world is a huge place, and the population of the world is beyond my personal scope. If I think about that particular number, I can't actually imagine that many people. And I think that we need to take that into account. International, global feminism, if we're going to call it that, it's so hard. We can't go toe-to-toe saying this is more important than this, because we'll all just fall into infighting. Now, yes, absolutely, women having to marry their rapists is a feminist issue, 100%. Is it worse as an experience than someone spreading their legs on the tube? Yes, absolutely. I think in this case it is simply about prioritising and about different cultures and where they are and what they need to do. Now, most women in the UK thankfully don't have to marry their rapist. However, we are still really bad at convicting rapists, and we still have quite a large number of rapes that occur in this country. We need to tackle that in the same way that other countries need to tackle women having to marry their rapists. Manspreading and mansplaining are still issues, even if they are perceived as less serious. I think that, to say that an issue that we're facing over here should be ignored because of an issue happening somewhere else is not actually very good for women's rights, There's so many things that, to debate in that. Should we all be concentrating on the more serious issue in another country? Or is that colonial for us all to go over there and be like, we're better than you and therefore we're going to fix your problem? That really has not worked out for this country in its global history. We'll just wrap up then. Maybe, it's a terrible thing to think, but maybe in that case it's aspirational to wait till manspreading and mansplaining are an issue. But I would also say that they are still issues. I'm not going to say they're more important or less important. They're not. It's a case of, how much women suffer. However, it's still a regular occurrence, it's still annoying, and things like mansplaining, what's being personally annoying, actually do affect things like workplace politics. And I've personally experienced that. And so whilst, it's a silly word and it slightly undermines the issue itself and it doesn't really explain the issue itself, it still needs to be important. To go back to egalitarian and feminism and all of that, my personal opinion is always going to be that women's rights is feminism, feminism is women's and humans' rights. And it depends on the semantics and the way the cake is cut. And I'm not saying egalitarian is a terrible label, or that if you're egalitarian, you're inevitably putting men's rights above women's rights. I think, for one thing, that really distracts from the gender binary. But I do think that there is a stigma around the word feminism. It might be a historical thing, but it's also about other things.
Could I just finally pop very briefly in on that, because I'm going to respectfully disagree in part with what you said. You see, not a hive mind. Because I don't think that cultural relativity trumps the universality of human rights. I am a human rights lawyer, I would say that. I do think that global violence against women and girls is an absolutely significant issue, and we absolutely must not allow the horrors of our colonial past to prevent us from joining hands with our sisters in other countries. That would be quite wrong. And I would just say that there's a whole load of panels on global violence against women and girls at the Philia conference. We do, as feminists, link hands with women across the globe. We do have them come over to speak. We go over to speak with them. It's not... but equally, as you did say, that doesn't make manspreading here any less irritating. But I would totally agree that it is a flea next to a tiger in the greater scheme of things.
Thank you. Clarify something?
Quickly, yes.
So when I said about like rapist in Pakistan, it could be rapist anywhere, and I didn't say like it was linked to Islam. You did.
No, I wasn't saying that. I was saying, and this actually ties in with what Julian was saying, is that this idea of cultural relativity and the fact that it is almost perceived that, it's being argued that you can't perceive injustice across, in other countries or environments. Of course you can perceive injustice. It's the solutions that is, it's presumptuous to presume that the solutions that work here are the same solutions that would work in other countries. And so what I was saying is, in a Muslim country, Islam should be the solution to those things. That's the only reason I was pointing that out.
It's like you said, like it's just the notion of like right and wrong is like everywhere the same. So my question was just like, do you think that things that could be seen as trivial, so like many women don't actually believe that manspreading is an issue, then maybe that would make them a bit too reluctant to use the word feminism, because it encompasses many things that they don't believe in. But that was it.
Sorry, okay, very good. Next question, over there.
I think for both sides of the panel, I wondered how people reflect on the phrase you put before, which was feminism isn't about man against women, but about humanity against patriarchy and toxic masculinity, because that doesn't sound right in my mind.
I said it, so I clearly believe it. I would say that yes, as I said before, feminism is often treated as a dirty word, and whilst I, don't really want to be like, you're a feminism, I would personally consider Zara's politics to be feminist. I hope she's not offended by that. And I think that, it's the fact that it is often seen as men versus women, is very much against the gender binary, but is also very dysfunctional. I think that the patriarchy is the systematic. I can't remember if I defined it or if I didn't define it clearly enough. But it's a systematic and pervasive system in our society, which will structurally allow men to be higher in various spheres than women, be they personal, work, social, political, and they also hinder men as well as women, whether it's, as Zara very much pointed out, them only being able to express themselves in anger, boys being told not to cry, the fact that every time England plays a World Cup match, domestic violence goes up 32%, I believe the figure is, those sorts of things affect everyone, and that whilst it does mostly hinder women, it does affect everyone, and by us all tackling the patriarchy together, many issues would be solved.
Surely that is pitching humanity against men if patriarchy is a male.
No, because it's about the systems, not the men themselves. You know, I'm an optimist and think there's very few men who actually do believe that men are superior to women. They are slightly concerned when men's rights activists were brought up, because their philosophy, if they claim it's equality, is definitely not equality. I think that it's those systems that we need to destroy, not men. I think there's very few feminists.
Can we add to call that, to give that system a male identity as a patriarchy?
Well, another thing that you can call it is kyriarchy, if you prefer, which comes from the Greek kyrios, lord, so a system that recognises the supremacy of rich men. So you've all got to get out your students. But I think it's undeniable that when you look at the systems of power, they tend to be male and wealthy. That doesn't mean that individual men are... but this is what we mean by class-based analysis. Sorry, jump straight in there. So, obviously, a homeless man is not perpetuating patriarchy, nor are most individual men, but a system which continues to elevate men as a class above women as a class is what we describe academically perhaps as patriarchy. But yes, people are increasingly referring to it as kyriarchy, ostensibly to demonstrate that these systems are underlined by corporate interests, but also, I have a suspicion, to preserve the finer feelings of men who don't like it.
I would also argue that women can absolutely perpetuate the patriarchy. Many women do perpetuate the patriarchy because it defends some of their own privileges, whether that be white, straight, cisgendered, etc. You often hear the refrain, not all men. This is absolutely true. Not all men. I would never say all men, or I would be very angry and ill-informed if I said all men. However, the refrain often goes, but all women. Not all men perpetuate sexual harassment, but all women will have encountered it in some flavour, whether it is catcalling on the street to more serious incidences. And therefore... And when I said we need to all address our own privilege and use it to lift other people up, I talk about male privilege, I talk about white privilege, I talk about straight privilege, I talk about cisgendered privilege. All of these none of us asked for these privileges, but nevertheless society has handed us these privileges. And whilst we can't really do much about the privilege we hold, what we can do is use it to try and make it an equal and more fair society. So whilst I know that it does offend some men when we talk about patriarchy, but we're not attacking men, we are attacking a system which is ingrained in our society to elevate them, often over women.
Just to clarify, I don't feel offended by the phrase. The original question was, how do those two sentences add up together? So I've got no offence by the phrase. People call it a patriarchy, but if we're saying it's not about men versus women, or women versus men, sorry, and then to say it's about feminism, toxic masculinity, that whole line of argument seems to fall down.
Sorry, going to have to move on there. No worries. One with a pink shirt, one row from the back. That's you.
I thought it was very interesting that you brought up Islam as well. So I don't understand, are you trying to say that Islam is a better way for achieving women's rights? Like, is it better than... is it a good way of achieving equality for men and women?
Well, I obviously think it is. The reason I brought it up is to show that different worldviews have different approaches to women's rights. So if women's rights is a broad category, again, as I mentioned earlier, like economics is a category there in society, and then different worldviews come up with different approaches to that issue. You have, capitalism, communism, and similarly for women's rights, you may have feminism, you may have Islam, you may have Judaism, Christianity, or other worldviews that also have their approaches to women's rights. So it's not about whether Islam is better or not. I certainly think it is, and perhaps on another day we can go into the details of that. But for the purpose of this question only, the reason I bring it up is to say there are alternatives to feminism. So if one does not identify as a feminist, that doesn't necessarily mean that they are against women's rights or they're not concerned about these issues that are brought up. It simply means it's okay to pick a different approach. and it should be okay to pick a different approach based on your conscience, based on what your convictions are and what convinces you.
That approach, is that approach similar to feminism in that does it want equality for men and women?
In Islam, yes, men and women are treated equally. There is, an equivalent concept of equality. So, for example, it says in the Quran, men and women, their deeds, I'm paraphrasing, their deeds will be judged exactly the same as one another. There's no inherent difference between men and women on that level. There are all sorts of...
Sorry, going to have to cut it short there. Next question will go over there.
Actually, I find the difficulty to identify my answer to this question according to you, because I agree to both. I understand your motives. I wonder if there is a halfway between both of you, because I disagree to one point. Universality or human rights. You say you agree to use egalitarianism from the perspective of human rights because you are with human rights. And also Islam and human rights are brought as universal terms, or feminism and Islam are both terms are from if they are taken as universal is to be debated, because Islam is diverse. There's not one Islam, by the way. So the equation you are talking about, or the egalitarianism, is not achieved from all the perspectives of Muslims. There are Salafis, there are Sunni, there are secular Muslims. So even there is a movement from the Middle East about secular feminism and religious feminism. This is what I can, but I agree with you from the perspective that yes, the word feminism causes problems if you, from your own perspective, that you want to change the structure of the systems that impose harassment over women or affects women's rights. Yes, this word feminist is very terrifying, very horrible. So how can, if there is a halfway between both of you, that, for example, secular feminism or Islamic feminism that take Islamic concepts, not because there's many interpretations of Islam, there is no one Islam, and how can, yes, Quran says, Sunnah says, but nobody agree on women's rights. Even women perpetuate patriarchal system at sometimes, as you have said, from Islamic perspective. So I prefer, in this case, to say this man is a feminist, is the best way to solve this. If a man is calling for or appealing for women's rights, yes, I agree to call him a feminist. Otherwise, women cannot be feminists. And I wonder if it's not a crisis of definition, it's a crisis of reception. Who defines or who determines the women's rights? If it is in a patriarchal society or a society that has this balance. I'm from Egypt. Up till now, we don't have women who is in position to change the structure. Because Muslim circle is overwhelming the rules, we need Muslims who understand Arabic, who understand...
Okay, sorry, going to need to cut that short.
Yeah, I just last thing to say,
very briefly.
Just last thing, about halfway, I just raised the point about Gertrude Spivak, about strategic feminism, that we took the terms to appeal for women's rights and then throw it or put it aside and take human rights system. So what about this, the possibility of achieving this message? I wonder.
Both sides respond?
Just a very brief comment on the idea that Islam is open to many interpretations. There are numerous schools of thought within Islam, but actually they agree on the majority of what Islam actually is. Even the notoriously divided Sunni and Shia, they agree on the majority of what Islam actually is. And a lot of the differences are very minor, like where do you place your hands during prayer, or smaller differences in issues of legal interpretations. So actually, Islam is not open to any interpretation, unlike feminism, which doesn't have a legal code, doesn't have a book, doesn't have a holy canon that says this is what feminism is and this is what feminism is not. Islam, on the other hand, does have this code by which you can delineate what is Islam and what is not. You can't say that worshipping 3 gods is from Islam. Islam is very clear. There is only one. Just as a small example, of course. And with regards to the structural difficulties that you mentioned, in Egypt, where women are not in a position to make changes that are meaningful, Egypt is a secular country. It's not a religious one at the moment. It's not an Islamic country. And so it is a secular regime at the moment. It's not operating on the principles of Islam in a holistic way. And so this might be, why these issues are there. So as for the term Islamic feminism, again, I would point out, why do we need feminism? If you say that Islam, or if you agree that even if you have your own interpretation of Islam and you say that how you see Islam liberates women, then why not advocate that and call yourself a Muslim loud and proud and say Islam says this? Why do we need to bring in other labels and imply that there is some deficiency? So I don't agree with the term Islamic feminism. I do think that Islam is holistic, and I don't think a clear term needs to have an ambiguous term added to it. And again, if it's about solidarity or getting numbers or getting support, then again, I do think it's about human will and persistence and educating people on the issues and the solutions towards that. I don't think a label alone can guarantee that you would get the right solution or the right outcome. And again, just to point out, again, this debate is not about the content of feminism, but as defining yourself as something other than that. But just briefly on the content of feminism, it doesn't have a solid set of solutions to many of the problems that we face. There are conflicting ideas about how to resolve issues. The objectification of women's bodies. Some schools of thought advocate, an androgynous approach to how women should present themselves. Others say, to be sex positive and to heighten the way that your sexuality increases your power. Others say do whatever you want. So there's no one solution amongst feminists. Whereas at least in Islam, you have a clarity. We have, a code for both men and women in terms of modesty and not exploiting the human body. But I'll leave it there. But it's just to mainly point out that Islam is not open to any interpretation, and feminism is open to any number of interpretations. And so there's no benefit in appending an ambiguous term to one that for us as Muslims should be a clear term.
Okay, shall I say anything?
I'd like to respond as well. I agree with you. We have essentially set up an impossible debate because we entirely disagree on what feminism is. I would say that feminism, whilst it has many different ways of defining it, and while there's many different people who use the term, it does just mean people who believe in gender equality and human rights. Whereas Zara is saying something completely different. So how we can possibly come to a middle of this is basically impossible. However, I will say that interpretation is difficult. Many people interpret things in different ways. I would argue that feminism is about, as I said, equality for everyone, and that when we have that equality and those systems in place, then it's about being able to do what you want to do, whether that's practicing a religion, wearing the clothes you want to wear, all of that sort of stuff. Again, in personal interpretation, I would say that a feminism that restricts actions, if those actions are not harming anyone else, is not feminism. But others will disagree with me. But I do also see that you point about interpretation. I would say that whilst there's many different ways people will argue that we can reach gender equality, feminism is not necessarily open to interpretation because it is about achieving gender equality. Interpretation is always interesting. I mean, we were talking earlier about how there's a lot of similarities between Islam and Judaism, and I would personally argue that Judaism is 90% terms and conditions, so there's a lot of interpretation of what is written. It comes down to, what do you believe feminist is? And whilst a lot of people like the term egalitarian or human rights or women's rights over the term feminist, I would just ask everyone to go away and think about, why do you dislike the term feminism if that's what you dislike? As you said, it's a really useful catch-all.
Doesn't achieve the change of structure. But I'm myself, how can I be a call for women's rights without I need so and so and so as a woman? This can be rejected. And from your own perspective, yes, I can say this a Western term that comes from colonialism, from Western society. So there must be a need to compromise the two terms. I can't reject feminism, I can't reject Islamic perspective, and there is by the way, many interpretations.
It feels like the side here is kind of agreeing with us that the definition is so confused that you can almost make it...
you've got that wrong. No. You're agreeing with us.
I don't think I am, but what we're seeing here is that we clearly... what we're seeing is we clearly disagree on what exactly it means to be a feminist. And I don't think that doesn't necessarily set it up as an impossible motion. I think, if anything, all that does is highlight my earlier point, is that if we can't, agree on what exactly it's about, like Zara said, there is no book of feminism, there's no gospel. So there is always going to be a question of identity. It's always going to come down to, well, what do you feel feminism is? And you seem to be taking the opinion that you can be a feminist whether or not you use the word, like your feminism in terms of your actions, in terms of various other things. But in that sense, in that case, what use is the label at all? Why not switch to a label of humanist or egalitarian? Because you haven't really done anything to show why someone who, for example, just considers themselves a humanist or an egalitarian and rejects the label of feminism, but still acts like they're a feminist, is doing something wrong. Someone could clearly then just not identify as a feminist, but if they, act as a decent human being and in a good way, and surely they'd then be doing the right thing. There's nothing wrong about that. In which case, we'd have to conclude it's not wrong to identify as a feminist.
I'm going to just very briefly come back on that, because what I would say is that if you are behaving in a way that is feminist, if you are behaving in that way, then the reason that it is wrong not to identify yourself or to be identifiable as a feminist is that if we are all cowering underneath the veil of, oh, well, please don't ask me to actually call myself a feminist, I'm just going to do all these feminist things, then we have no language. Words have meaning, and we need that language to be able to say, I am a feminist, you are a feminist, we will work together for the liberation of women and girls. And that is where the identity, the label is valuable. It is to identify ourselves and to do that work together without hiding from that. That's what I would say to that. So I would say it is wrong not to identify as a feminist.
Okay, this is a great time to call for a vote. So I'm going to take the Zara approach and do a yes or no and not embarrass myself again. So who says yes to the motion? Who agrees? Raise your hands.
Wait, who agrees that it's okay to be a feminist,
No.
to identify as feminist?
Who's saying yes to the motion? Yes.
Yes, so
Yes,
it is wrong not to
Yes,
identify
yes.
as feminist.
Clear as mud for me again. Anyway,
Oh, we convinced them. How lovely.
okay, thank you very much. Who's saying the opposite? Who's disagreeing with that? Okay, so. Is anyone still abstaining? Anyone still unsure? Okay, right. So to start with, saying yes to the motion, we had 2 people, and now we have 12. Saying no to the motion, we had 36. Now we have 55. My maths may be horrible, but that's how many hands I saw, no one's put it, And we had undecided, we had 15, and now we have 6. So, big round of applause.